climate change an environmental risk, it's also an economic risk. And so the assessment that we're releasing on Monday, right, it's the 5th in our full disclosure series, looks at the ability of banks and companies to identify and address climate risks. So what we've done is we've looked at annual reports of companies, and these are the 10 highest GHG or greenhouse gas emitters in the country, the likes of Eskom, Sasol, ArcelorMittal. And then we've looked at the 5 banks. And we've looked at their annual reports, disclosures made to a particular kind of project known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, and various other disclosures that they've made around how they will be addressing climate risk. So I think what's quite critical is that we found that for most of these companies, they identify climate change as both a transitional and a physical risk, right? So it's a risk that they need to address in the short, medium, and long term, but it's also a physical risk to infrastructure and to operations, right? Particularly where you're looking at Eskom and Sasol, etc. So they've all identified climate change as a risk. But what we found in our report is that not all companies have been able to point out in their strategies in a meaningful way how they plan to address those risks.
Do they have an obligation to do that, though? I mean, we always get the sense that companies are just obliged to make sure they're not breaking the law in terms of Labor Relations Act, et cetera, et cetera. But if they're making their profit, that's really all they're there for. Do they have an objective to actually address climate risks?
That's an incredibly important question, because here we don't necessarily have domestic or South African laws and obligations in place at the moment. We have a climate change bill that is still being looked at in Parliament and is yet to be passed. But importantly, what we've done in conducting this assessment is that we've looked at a kind of more global standard, right? So this is the Task Force on climate-related financial disclosures, and what we term the TCFD. What the TCFD does is it provides a framework for companies and banks to be able to understand, one, how they should disclose their risks, and what are the terms on which those disclosures should be made. And it's a really important kind of guideline and framework. It's important because even though it's not part of South African legislation or regulation, it's a framework that over 850 companies around the world have signed up to and said, we take this framework seriously and we want to be able to disclose the risks the climate risks that our company identifies, and we want to be able to disclose the strategies to be able to address that risk. And what's really important there is that when you actively disclose the risks and your strategies to address that risk, you then kind of reassure investors, consumers, even national governments that you're capable of adapting to current conditions which say that we only have 11 years to prevent kind of major environmental catastrophes and destruction. You've seen it just before this particular segment. You reported on tornadoes in KZN.
Yeah.
It's very unusual. It's all climate related. But importantly, will companies, particularly South African banks and companies, be resilient enough to adapt quickly enough to address those risks and to prevent economic kind of and profit losses here?
Yeah, to me it almost sounds like a matter of life and death, at least for the establishment itself. I want to get a sense from you how much of a priority this is for these establishments. Because again, it almost seems like an afterthought that companies will not only give resources to combating climate change, but even just, time. It feels like it's one of those relegated discussions in the day-to-day operations of particularly major conglomerates. I mean, how high up the agenda is this, do you get the sense from companies?
Look, from the 15 companies that we've assessed, right, this is including the emitters, which is your Sasol, Eskom, etc., and the banks. They do identify this as a priority, but I don't think that they've placed enough time and energy, as you say, into making sure that this priority is addressed properly. That's what our finding really is about. And you've got to ask yourself why. why aren't companies focused on this enough? And is it perhaps about a fear of moving from a very well-established kind of approach to development, which is a reliance on coal and fossil fuels in order to generate power and electricity and, the kind of model that we've all been used to a rather more uncertain model that looks more into renewable energy and kind of divesting from fossil fuels and investing in renewable energy. We've seen movements towards this, but is it going to be enough within this very short window that we have in order to make sure that temperatures remain below a particular level to avoid, all the impacts that we're all kind of already seeing, right? Yeah. And so ultimately, I think it's discussions like this. It's informing investors. It's consumers saying, that's my bank. Yeah. That's investing my money. Yeah. That's a pension fund that's investing my money. I want to know what they're doing with that money. I want to know whether they're investing in fossil fuels and whether they're making the shift into renewable energy. Yeah,
you speak about banks, which I find incredibly interesting because it's easy to create ties about how ESCOMs and the Sasols of this world are contributing to climate change. Obviously, they emit fuel and that does a whole lot of stuff to the atmosphere. But banks? What are banks emitting into the atmosphere? I mean, help us understand how, an institution like a bank is also contributing to climate risk.
Look, the question you've got to ask yourself is who loans money to these institutions? In order to kind of get, the project finance they need for either mining coal or, continuing to be invested in coal. And we've seen that at the moment, at least only Nedbank is fully disclosing its investment in coal assets, at least from the information that we've obtained. And so other banks need to be able to, in a very public, very kind of meaningful way, say, how much have we invested? How much have we loaned to industries that are fossil related? And we're not saying that it's just directly to our kind of big GHG emitters. Logistics and the infrastructure that support these industries, because we need to create a rapid shift away from fossil fuels and the infrastructure that support it. And banks are central to that.
In the absence of laws compelling these companies to do right by really citizens through the investment patterns, et cetera, how else are they held accountable outside of us relying on their goodwill to do the right thing?
Look, you've seen shareholder activism being quite important. Where civil society organizations, ordinary members of the public who own shares in particular companies, go to AGMs and in a very public way question companies and have an opportunity to question the chairman of the board, right, about commitments to climate change. What kind of strategies do you have in place? And that's proven really effective. Organizations like Just Share, for example, that we work quite closely with, and others, community organizations and partners, Groundwork, the South Durban Alliance, have all been involved in challenging companies through shareholder activism, but also challenging them directly, by writing to them, by asking questions, and educating communities and consumers about the very important rights that they have to question these companies and banks.
Excellent stuff. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and incredibly informative exchange. That's Leanne Govindsamy from the Center of Environmental Rights. Thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate it. Now, though, rated one of South Africa's most sought-after residential estates, Steyn City has received an additional 5.5 billion rand for the establishment of a helipad and man-made beach lagoon. The estate was first established in 2015 and is situated at the foot of Fourways. Residents say it's lived up to its founder's vision of a peaceful city living. Newsroom Africa's Cindy Siwa